Welcome, everyone. I am so glad to have you all here with me in the Meet Your Mentor podcast. For those of you who are coming back to another episode, then welcome back. You guys already know me a little bit. For those of you who are first-time listeners and don't know much about me, my name is Elise, and I will be your host for today. Currently, I am a sophomore in high school, and I'm obviously here interning at the Mentor Project, which gives me the chance to talk to so many incredible people. In regards to this podcast, each week I will be interviewing one of our world-renowned mentors and asking about their job, maybe how they knew it was their passion, what it means to be a mentor, and so much more. Quick shout out to our listeners and our sponsors for making this podcast possible. Now, I think you guys will love what we have in store for you today. The mentor I have the privilege of interviewing today is Janice Lintz. She focuses her work on developing ideas to transform organizations to make them accessible for all people, including those who may have a physical or mental impairment. Janice is most known for her work as the CEO of Hearing Access and Innovations, which is a business dedicated to helping all platforms and organizations to make things more accessible for the deaf population. She has worked with tons of different organizations such as Apple, Capital One, Delta Airlines, and so many more. Please give a warm welcome to Janice. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. I should just clarify, it's deaf and hard of hearing is my specialty, just to clarify, but thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for letting me know. That's, I feel like I'm very glad you mentioned that, because I feel that a lot of people don't always kind of group those together, you know what I mean?
I think part of the problem is people don't really understand generally the distinction between the deaf population and the hard of hearing population, and it kind of clump everything together and don't really understand that how different they are.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Well, I mean, to get us started, do you want to explain the difference and maybe talk about that a little bit?
That would be great, because it is a common misperception. So within the hearing loss spectrum of approximately 48 million people with some form of hearing loss, less than 1% uses sign language, but sign language is critical to the people who need it. But the perception is that most people use sign language with a hearing loss, but that's inaccurate. Most people use one of three things, and less than 1% use sign language, or about 500,000 people. So the other two things that people use is a visual or assistive devices. Assistive devices bringing sound to a person's hearing, and not dissimilar to us wearing headphones, right? But you're bringing it to someone's hearing aid or cochlear implant. The other is visual, turning the sound into a visual format like captions. And then you have a lot of gray area between them. So I call this the three-prong approach. You need all three types of access to reach the full spectrum of people with hearing loss. But the perception is that most people with hearing loss are deaf because you can see sign language. You can't see someone's hearing aids. You can't see the access, if they're not wearing hearing aids, that they're using captions. So that's why there's a lot of misperceptions.
Gotcha. Yeah, it definitely is, like, that's a very clear reason. But I think that's why it's so important to have people like you who are speaking out and explaining what, really, like, what the actual facts are.
Thank you. Yes, I am. And I think it's important because, I think it's, unless you're involved in it or somehow face it, it's not something you would necessarily know. Everybody has a lot of things busy in their life. And the issue is people don't know. There isn't anyone explaining this just generally. And so people have no idea. And then they're always surprised that sign language doesn't impact most people because they can see it.
Yeah. So, like, how did you get started in this field, and how did you know it was something that you wanted to pursue for most of your life?
It wasn't something that I selected. It selected me. So I have a daughter who, when she was 2.5, was diagnosed with a hearing loss. And so when the doctor diagnosed her, the doctor said immediately there were these special schools for her. But the doctor's idea of special schools and my idea of special schools were not the same. My idea of special was Ivy League or equivalent type of schools. Yeah. The doctors were a different idea. And I was unwilling to change the standards for my family's life and decided it was easier to change the world than to change my standards. But it wasn't like I entered this and I thought, oh, this will be my new career. It was really, when I entered, a very selfish endeavor. It was about getting our family to be able to function. I didn't see it as a career. It was like, how do we go to museums? How do we go to the theater? I mean, there's only so many times, as much as I love Mummenschanz, that I wanted to go to silent theaters because my daughter didn't need to hear. And I couldn't figure out how we could function if she couldn't hear the performances. And when you live in New York City, it's really impossible to not go to the theater, not partake of the culture. It's why I live in New York City. And so I had to fix things. And then along the way, there was a certain tipping point where I realized this was more than just our family. I also realized that the projects took much longer. And I had a plan. One of the projects I worked on was New York City's taxis. That took 9 years. So I had to think longer than what she was doing at that moment and think about her future. Mm-hmm. And so, but at some point I realized this was my career, but it chose me. I didn't choose it.
Yeah. It's very moving that you have that personal connection to it. That's kind of like an incredible way you found out about all this progress that needed to be made, which is kind of leads into my next question, which is I'm not sure exactly how long you've been working on progressing society to be more accessible, but how has it changed in that time? Have you seen a lot of noticeable progress?
So I started this in 2002, and it's really interesting. As I went to law school to change the world, I didn't realize this would be the topic that I would pick. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But since 2002, I've definitely seen changes, especially since Black Lives Matter has really helped the disability community, because the people with disabilities, I think, are riding on the coattails of Black Lives Matter, because and not just Black Lives Matter, the trans movement, there's been, as society is realizing that discriminatory practices, I think, have come, the Me Too movement, everything has come to a head very quickly. Yeah. Disabilities is part of that grouping. And so all of a sudden I'm seeing, I would say in the last 6 months, an acknowledgement that disabilities are part of that. For the beginning part, disabilities were not. And there were diversity programs that were ignoring disabilities, and the disability community spoke up about when you do diversity and you don't include disabilities, you don't have diversity. And I always say the D in diversity is to remember about disabilities. But in the beginning, it was not happening. I would say since the beginning of the year with the new administration, President Biden thankfully has a very different philosophy than his predecessor. Yeah. And access needs to be built in to projects. And there's suddenly a dramatic change that it's like a breath of fresh air. It really is just amazing.
Yeah, I'm sure that's incredible to watch, knowing all the work that you've gone through to try to get this started as well. So what are some big ways that allies can help who like me are just students or aren't heads of companies who can change a lot of things? What are some ways that we can help?
Well, I think one of the things for company heads, I would love to see CEOs, two different things. Yeah. One, I'd like to see people with disabilities on boards. There's the perception, and I filed an SEC comment about this. There's the perception that people with disabilities can't participate on boards. I have a disability, a learning disability, and an autoimmune disease, and I could easily be on a board. My qualifications clearly, I'm more than qualified. But yet, when you tell someone you have a disability, or that people think you have a disability, you're suddenly excluded. And I think we need to change that. And if people with disabilities aren't on boards, then they can't have that discussion built into companies, because there's nobody in the room discussing the disability. And, if somebody uses a wheelchair, why does that preclude them from being on a board? That's crazy. It makes absolutely no sense. So I think that's is we need to start moving people with disabilities onto board positions, not advisory boards, board positions in the corporate boardroom. Secondly, I'm really getting tired of companies, using disabilities as a PR effort. Just signing on to certification companies or doing a big press release. I think the most notable is Starbucks, where you have a company who they do this big thing. Look at us. We're doing, we have people, baristas serving coffee who are deaf. We have a special store with deaf. But yeah, their stores don't have induction loops that enable a person with a hearing loss to hear sound directly in their hearing aid or cochlear implant. I want to see companies walk the talk. I want to see induction loops that allow a person with hearing loss to hear the speaker behind the register in stores, in retail operations. The same way Delta has added it to their gates, I want to see other airlines add it to their gates. We need to move this as where it's a one-off project where someone has advocated for it. It has to be built into the corporate culture. We need to move access out of HR and construction and into the corporate ethos, where this is what we do. It's more than just, a public relations effort. So that's what I'd love to be able to see from corporations, a real commitment of this is who we are. I mean, we see this, hotels are notorious for this, where I'll find hearing access in a hotel in one location, but not another location. And I'll email the CEOs and say, why is this? Why do you have it in one place, but not another? It should be corporate wide. And even if you're franchise owned, you require all the companies, all the franchises to use the same cup or whatever it is that is consistent. Access for people with disabilities needs to be consistent across the board.
There's a word for kind of what you're describing that's not coming to mind at the moment. But I do agree that like you said, some of these companies, I hadn't even realized, like Starbucks, like you said, that they were doing that. But now that you're bringing that to my attention, it's very, very clear that they're kind of just doing it to say, oh, we're so progressive, we're so great, but then they're not actually following through on those promises and they're not doing what they should be. And they need to be listening to the hard of hearing and deaf population. I feel like you said as well, with people on boards there, it's just a bunch of hearing people talking about kind of what their standards should be for people who can't hear as well. Is that kind of correct?
Yes.
Am I correct in my assumption?
And that's exactly the problem. When you have people on the board who aren't familiar with it, they're making decisions. But also for the case of Starbucks, in my opinion, Starbucks reacts. There's a lawsuit filed. They come up with a new plan where it should be before the lawsuits. It should be, you shouldn't have to react to a lawsuit, but it also shouldn't be like that's the way the culture is. The culture should be inclusive, and that access is part of the ethos, the corporate culture. Google has just announced, for example, that their maps are now going to start including induction loops. I just saw an article about it. I haven't confirmed this. But that's wonderful. That's the corporate culture of, oh my God. And if once I receive confirmation, that will change everything, because once people start seeing it on their maps, then they'll start adding it and we'll be able to track it. That's the corporate culture I want to see, where it's built in, it's omnipresent, it's universal access. That's phenomenal. And when we start seeing that, that's going to be the actual tipping point of changing access for people with hearing loss.
Yeah. Just to make sure that I have a clear understanding, as well as anyone who's listening, can you describe a little bit specifically what an induction loop is? I believe is the word you used.
Yes, and thank you. My error. So an induction loop allows a person with a hearing loss to hear sound directly in their ear through their hearing aid or cochlear implant. So I know you're in Michigan. At Michigan State University in the stadium, they have an induction loop in the entire stadium, which is incredible. So you can hear the sports announcements right in your hearing aid or cochlear implant just by turning them to the telecoil, the T setting. That's phenomenal. So in New York City, You have that in taxis, subway information booths, where you can hear the sound of the person in the information booth right in your hearing aid or cochlear implant. As the train is going by at 90 decibels an hour, all that sound is blocked out. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And so if you imagine you're in a coffee location and you're ordering, and those tend to be noisy, you could hear the barista calling your name. You can hear the barista saying, do you want milk? Do you want sugar? You can have a conversation. Yeah. It's more than ticking a box, on a piece of paper. You want to be able to hear, and you don't want someone else telling you how to receive information.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's all really, really great information. But so for students or people who want to help, what are some of the major ways just like any random person could try to help? Whether obviously I cannot speak for you or this community, but some of the things that were coming to mind were like correct terminology and things like that. Like, can you just talk about that a little bit?
So correct terminology is one of the projects I'm working on, and I'm really excited. AP is changing their style book, which is the style book that journalists rely on for appropriate language. And I'm thrilled to have encouraged them to have done this. And they're in the middle of working on it, but they're changing the mindset of journalists. And so the impact of that will be dramatic, because journalists will no longer refer to people by their disability. It'll be only relevant if the disability is part of the story. But if the person, for example, uses a wheelchair, but it's not part of the story, the wheelchair is omitted. Because would you describe somebody's any other body part, right? Would you ever say like, oh, the thin person or the fat person? No, you wouldn't. Why would you describe somebody's body or what they do unless it's relevant? In addition, if they're not sure how the person likes to be referred, some people want to be referred to as disabled. Some people want to be referred to as they have a disability. Some people don't want to have it. The reporter will now start to ask those questions so that they are deciding how they are referred to and someone isn't deciding for them. And I think that's really critical. So in the case of people who are deaf and hard of hearing, it's important to refer to people with disabilities if you're unsure as a person first, and their disability is an adjective, but not defining them. So it's a person with a disability, it's a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. If the person then says, no, I want to be referred to as the deaf person, that is absolutely their choice, but they need to tell you and self-identify. But we don't want people pigeonholing people. Some people wear their disability proudly, and that's amazing. Other people don't want to be defined by it. And it's like sort of I guess the best way is pre-pandemic, I had blonde hair. It's not so blonde anymore, but I wouldn't want to be referred to as the blonde, right? That's considered derogatory. I might have blonde hair, but you might, in a story, if it's relevant and you're describing my hairstyle, say, and it's blonde. But you would never discuss my blonde hair because it would be considered demeaning. You would never call me the blonde because that's very demeaning. It's really not relevant to the story unless we're discussing what shampoos or my hairstyle. It's that kind of, it's the same thing. And so I'm very excited that's going to be changing.
Yeah, that sounds like a really incredible thing to be working on. Hopefully that will become the standard. Obviously, that's what you're working towards. Shifting gears a little bit. So obviously you're here working with the Mentor Project. So what does it mean to you to be a mentor and to be able to kind of help mold these minds of younger generations?
It's interesting because it's not only younger generations, it's even older generations. I think it's really important to mentor people and help. First off, I've been mentored by some amazing people. So I view it as paying it forward. And helping people is how, I think if you put out good in the world, good comes back to you. And it's important you can never thank the people who have helped you. So it's critical to be able to help someone else. And therefore, you're paying it forward. And that's kind of just the entire philosophy of how I've lived my life. And, it's just the way I live my life. I think it's very important.
Yeah, that's amazing. My last question pretty much is just, what if someone's listening or watching and wants to find out more about you or even get in contact, what would be the best way for them to do that?
They can find me, of course, on LinkedIn at Janice Lintz. My advocacy website is janicelintz.com, and my consulting website is hearingaccess.com.
Okay.
And I'm very easily found online.
Okay, that's all good to know. Well, this has been really, really interesting, and I'm very thankful you were here today. This is like a lot of incredible information, obviously, and I feel like I'm hoping to obviously publicize and share this with as many people as possible, because I think this is something that people need to hear about. So thank you so much, Janice. I hope everyone who's watching found that super compelling and learned as much as I did. If you want to learn more about Janice, you can feel free to visit the places that she mentioned. And if you want to learn more about the Mentor Project in general and what we are trying to achieve, you can go to mentorproject.org to learn more about us. I hope to see everyone here back here next week, Thank you so much to our listeners and our watchers and our sponsors for making this podcast possible. We appreciate everything you do. So thank you guys so much.